All right, let's move in to the AFC South. I have the Houston Texans at 11-6. I think my biggest thing with the Texans is there was a lot of games where I feel like they should have won, and I could see them actually having like a 12 win season. I just think I want to see year two of CJ Stroud and how everything meshes together with all the new additions on offense. So I do think that the Texans will definitely be a good team, and I think they'll be better than last year. I just think the AFC South might be one of the weirder divisions in the league where it's like kind of the opposite of the NFC South. Like the AFC South, like everyone's feisty and can win any week, right? But the Texans, in my opinion, are probably the favorite outside of Jacksonville. Whereas like the NFC South is like everyone kind of stinks. So it's like anyone can win any week, for the most part. So I think my biggest thing with the Texans this year is how many divisional wins are they going to win? They play Chicago week 2. I think they win that game. They play the NFC North, which is a tough division. But then outside of that, they're playing Buffalo, and then they're playing Green Bay. They're playing the Jets. They're playing Dallas. Like, I don't know what Dallas is going to be this year. But then they have Kansas City and Baltimore, two of their last 3 games. So they have a relatively tough schedule. I do think they stand a chance in almost any game this year. I guess you could say a weakness is their cornerback room, but I don't know if there's a big glaring weakness on this team.
No, well, to your point about the corners, especially after seeing that, look, we were a little worried about where and not just we. I say we as kind of like an NFL draft evaluating populace, right? Like we were a little worried about where Kamari Lassiter was going to end up rounding out. Kamari Lassiter is already your starting Y corner, which is fantastic for your Texans fans. You don't have to worry about slotting. You don't have to worry about storing him his depth. He's straight out starting on basically every set you're going to have on the field. He is going to be starting on every set you have on the field defensively. So you already have basically not a proven starter, but at least in camp, a guy who's proven he's going to come out and be an effective player on this team this year. I think really what I need to say about the Texans is just look, well, number one, I had them rounding out at 11-6. So I have them as the, I do have them number one in the division at 11-6. I don't want to spoil anything, but I just have to say it off the bat so that the Texans fans aren't sick of me. Maybe that's not enough wins, but 11-6, winning the division. And I think, just to top it all off, like you already said, Hunter, the big problem that I had, why I didn't have them having more wins despite being one of the best rosters in the league, is that, look, schedule is really tough towards the back end of the season. There's some games in there I don't really know how to feel about. And again, back to also just how I did it where I split the division games. I mean, that's already 3 losses right there. So having a tough schedule, splitting division games, it was going to be harder to get them over 11 wins. But bottom line, nonetheless, still a majorly improved roster on both sides of the ball. Young superstars coming into their own, right? We got Stroud, we got Stingley, right? I mean, we got Nico Collins, Tank Dell. You added Stephon. We've already gone on the whole spiel. I mean, you have guys, Will Anderson, Dean Hunter. You have guys all over. The Texans very much could win the Super Bowl. They're a team that rounded out probably lower in my simulation than they will end up rounding out in real life. And that's really all I have to say on it. It's kind of like they're a prime example of how hard the simulation is, where, yes, you want certain teams to do better, but when you're doing it on paper, sometimes it just doesn't work out that way.
100%. I think that's the biggest thing about the Texans is, like, to be fair in the simulation without like cheaping other teams out, I think 11-6 is like a good baseline for them. I think they could finish 10-7. I think they can finish 12-5. I think anywhere between those 3 wins is great for them. Moving in to the Indianapolis Colts. Oh, one last thing on the Texans. We all expect them to take another jump this year, but we don't know how this coaching staff is going to adjust to having tape on them. That's the last thing I'll say. Moving in to the Indianapolis Colts, I had them at 9-8. I think they're a good team, but this is basically like Anthony Richardson's rookie year, and I don't know if he looked all that great in the preseason game. It is preseason, but I need to see it out of A-Rich before I give the Colts their flowers. I think if anyone can do it, Shane Steichen is definitely one of the better play callers and quarterback whisperers in the league, looking at what he did with Jalen Hurts. But with that being said, I think the Colts are a somewhat unproven commodity in terms of outside of Michael Pittman, you have Adonai Mitchell, Josh Downs, who's currently injured, and Jonathan Taylor, who had an injury last year. So it's kind of like A. Rich's development is outside of Michael Pittman, kind of placed on these unproven commodities. And I think another thing that doesn't help is they play in a tough division. So while I think they could easily be better than 9-8 and potentially make the playoffs, as they're on the verge last year when they lost to the Texans, it's going to be a big figuring out year of like, where do we stand in the AFC? I think that's one of the biggest things is where do we stand in the AFC and how much more talent do we need to add to be a real competitor?
Okay, and you know what? It's funny. I just got to say right off the bat here. We do. This is the first team I think today that's come up where we actually do have not significantly, but slightly like different viewpoints on how the season can go. And let me be clear. This is one of those ones where I'm always I'm upfront. This is one of my maybe jackass moments where we could look back on this. This might be I might be pushing it here. Especially when we get to another team soon. I'm sorry. Again, I only worked with the sheet in front of me, guys. I had, you know what I mean? I didn't know narratives were applied. I did week to week. This is how things ended up for me. And I want to include this too. When it started out, the first like 7 weeks, the Colts were like 2-5. And I was like, oh God, I was like, the Colts fans are going to kill me. Like, what am I going to do? Like, how am I going to explain this to these Colts fans? But some way, somehow, they ended up at 10-7. Second in the division in that playoff spot.
You're crazy.
So, but let me explain. Right? Other than that, I was just picking the games and it just ended up this way, right? But let me explain how I think it got that way. I looked at a lot of the matchups and I would say to myself that not only would the Colts win a lot of the offensive line matchups, but they also win a lot of defensive line matchups. And you know how I feel about trenches, right? Yeah. This Colts unit has an absolutely loaded trench group on both sides.
I heard Latu's been tearing it up.
Yeah, well, I was gonna say exactly. And Latu's not even right. He could very well be the best guy on the line this year, but they already have a lot of really talented guys. So it bodes incredibly well for the trenches of this team. And let's move on to look, I'm with you 1,000%. And this is kind of the bottom line for my whole spiel for the Colts this season. Back to the jackass whole spiel is if Anthony Richardson doesn't make a jump or even regresses somehow, which would really break my heart. But if one of those two happen, the Colts are not going to be 10-7, and this is going to be a terrible take. But I'm banking on that he's going to be able to make enough of a jump, especially, again, I always go back to what I expected him to look like those first few weeks last year before all the injuries started piling up, and what I got. I got a much better version of Anthony Richardson a much more polished version than I thought I was going to get.
I agree.
So that same kind of, we can turn over that same wheel to this season, and A. Rich can look like a much better version of what I expected again, which sounds hypocritical because I'm expecting what I don't expect. You get what I'm saying. I expect another jump. Let me be clear. And with Shane Steichen. So I think the Shane Steichen, him being able to develop Anthony Richardson, this team has loaded trench units. They have, at this point, I would say, a good receiving core, right? Like A.D. Mitchell, Josh Downs, Michael Pittman Jr. I really like what they got going on over there. The DB situation is not bad at all. Like you have all guys that are not like elite, but they're very, very serviceable, if not productive starters. So you're really the most worried about the linebacking core, right? In this 4-3 defense, because there's not really one guy you can point to and be like, yeah, he's a dominant, inside backer. But it's not, to say this disrespectfully, but generally it's not the most important part of the modern defenses, and you can kind of plug and play guys depending on situations and matchups. So all that to say that if Anthony Richardson has a good year, I really do believe this Colts team can be a playoff team. And that's kind of what I'm banking on.
No, I think so too. I think they have the possibility. So you have them making the playoffs, correct? I do.
And let me be clear. I did not plan it that way. I didn't think it was going to go that way. I thought for sure another team that I'm not going to name yet was going to make it over.
But I think it's definitely possible they make the playoffs. I think that stems a lot on Anthony Richardson's development, and I need to see it a little bit more. I think the biggest thing I'm concerned about too is the shoulder injury. We saw how badly it affected Cam Newton, and I'm not trying to compare the two. But anytime, like, even Deshaun Watson with the shoulder injury, anytime a quarterback has a shoulder injury, it concerns me. So overall, I think that's a fair, like, anywhere from like 8 to 10 wins for the Colts seems realistic. Let's move in to probably the most confusing team in the NFL. I had them making the playoffs at 10-7. We have the Jacksonville Jaguars. So, I like what they did with Brian Thomas Jr. Substituting Calvin Ridley for Gabe Davis. All right, I guess. It is definitely cheaper, for sure.
All right.
Yeah, it's okay, I guess. I do think the defense will take a step. I think the defense will be better this year. I think if Doug Peterson is able to take over play calling like he should have last year from Press Taylor, I think they will be much better off on offense. I think we're going to see a little bit more of like a vertical attack from the Jags this year, get a little bit more back into that as opposed to horizontal routes and everything like that. A lot of people also forget that Evan Ingram is there, and Evan Ingram has been a very productive tight end for them. I think another thing that we can consider is Tank Bigsby might be a great 1-2 punch this year with ETN. They improve the offensive line. Anton Harrison's in his second year. I think there's just a lot of things that can go right for the Jacksonville Jaguars this year. They do have a relatively tough schedule. Their wins probably come from splitting one with Indy, maybe beating Miami or Buffalo, and then you could beat Chicago. You're going to beat New England. You could beat Minnesota. Tennessee, maybe you get 2 on them, but then you have Las Vegas. So it's a relatively tough schedule. I don't think they have really any cakewalks this year outside of New England.
No, absolutely. And so let's be clear, Jags fans, let's just get straight to the point. Number one, like I got to preface, like I don't preface for most teams, but I'm preface for the Jaguars. This is one of those ones where like really, and that's why I said at the beginning of the whole video, this isn't always going to align with necessarily what I think is going to happen. Which is what's so hard about doing these schedule, right? Doing it week to week. I had you guys somehow, unfortunately, Jags fans, I'm sorry. I had you guys rounding out at 8-9, missing the playoffs. But again, do I think that that's necessarily what's going to happen? I could see, like, hands up, honesty. I can see the Jaguars going and winning 10 to 12 games this year, 100% and making the playoffs. I can totally see that happening. And I actually lean towards that. What that was what's going to happen. I think in the schedule, again, back to you have to throw some teams a bone here and there. You have to fit some wins in for teams that wouldn't have wins elsewhere. And the Jaguars were kind of just on the brunt end of that, maybe in this schedule simulation, right? Where they kind of got the bad end of some of those games. But even despite all that, this finish is still possible. The negative one, right? Finishing to me at 8-9 is still possible. Where look, it's kind of here's if the worst case scenario to happen, I think to me this is what it's going to be. This O-line group, and I know we talked about this on end here for a while now, Hunter. I think a lot of Jags fans are kind of like, I don't want to say like on board with their O-line, but me and you, it's kind of like, yeah, this O-line still needs a fair amount of work, especially when you have a guy like Trevor Lawrence back there. The O-line to me, number one, is just not cutting it yet. I think I'm really, really big on Brian Thomas Jr. long term. I don't know what we're going to get this year. I think we're going to get some splashes, some really good stuff. I don't know. We're just not going to get peak. There's just no way we're going to get peak Brian Thomas Jr. yet. Christian Kirk on the slot. I like that. Over to Gabe Davis. Literally week to week. 1 week he's going to give you 100 yards and 7 catches, and 1 week he's going to give you 0 on 4 targets. It's the weirdest anomaly in football. And then on the defensive side, to your point, Hunter, they got a lot. They really did get a lot better, which is why it really does hurt me to have them missing the playoffs and having them have a record that I don't necessarily envision for the season. But again, you know what? You put it on paper and sometimes it doesn't go the way you want it. It's kind of how it went for me and the Jaguars in this simulation right here. But all in all, I just want to make it crystal clear. The Jaguars still very much are in that competitive range and not just competing for a playoff spot or whatever. The Jags are competing to go win the Super Bowl. Now, is it likely? Still no. But when you have Trevor Lawrence back there and you got Doug Peterson, they've showed us. Look, I'm not going to count them out by any means. All in all, the Jags, like Hunter, you said, they're a confusing team. And that's really just the main way you could slice it.
I think the biggest thing for me with why I have the Jags making the playoffs is, okay, I want to compare them to the Dolphins last year, right? Both competitive teams that had Super Bowl aspirations, and the Jags folded on the back end of the season. But this offseason, I will argue that the Jaguars got not significantly better, but just a notch under it. They add Eric Armstead. They extend Tyson Campbell. They go out and improve the offensive line. They get Brian Thomas Jr. Like, to me, the Jaguars did what they needed to take the steps to become that Super Bowl contender, really. Whereas I don't think the Dolphins did, and that's why I think I'm a little bit higher on them than maybe you are. I just believe in what the defense can be this year. I think they could be a pretty special unit, and I think they're pretty underrated.
No, and again, I'm really with you. Like Jags fans, I'm trying to make it, I'm trying to make it as clear as I can. They just got the short end of the stick. They got maybe a few where I had to toss a few teams a bone. That's really, I think, how it ended up rounding out. Let's just end it on this note. Jags fans, I do lean that you guys will be a playoff team, that you guys will figure it out this year. Because as me and Hunter have discussed to extent on previous episodes, if the Jags don't figure it out this year, well, there's going to be a lot of turnover and a lot of things you got to figure out, because another year of mediocrity is not going to be accepted with Trevor Lawrence in the building.
Let's move into our last team of the AFC South. I have the Tennessee Titans at 7-10. This team was weird because their start of the schedule is really, really tough. They start out with they have Chicago. I think that's a 50-50 game. They have the Jets, Green Bay, Miami, Indy, Buffalo, Detroit, and then they get New England, the Chargers, who are not pushovers, Minnesota. Then they have Houston, and then they end the year with Cincinnati, Houston, Jacksonville, and Indy. So very rough schedule. And I think with all the veteran talent that they have on the team, I understand why people may be out on the Titans and why people may be in on the Titans. Like, I'll buy either side of it. That's the best way to say it, literally. Yeah,
I'm
more on the side of I don't see them making the playoffs this year, and that's why I have them at 7-10. But I do think the floor for this team is relatively high with all the vets, and I do think Will Levis is not the worst. I think an offensive-minded head coach can really make this offense effective, and I think they have they have a pretty decent defense. So I think maybe the floor for this team is going to be 6 wins. I think they might end up like 7-10, 8-9.
No, yeah, I have them. Great minds think alike on this one, bro. I also have them rounding out at 7-10, and it's kind of just, I think you said it best. Like, they could finish slightly better, but I still think all in all, this team would have to really make a crazy push, and more than just this team, Will Levis would have to make an astronomical jump for them to be a playoff team this year. I really do believe, because it's more just, I think for me, I'll say it like this. I come take a look at the defense and I say, okay, wait a minute. This is what scares me a little bit, is that, okay, Jamal Adams and Kenneth Murray are both starting on this defense. And you might say, you're saying to me, that's just two spots. That's just two, whatever.
Yeah.
Just two really rough guys to have starting in the year 2024, 2025. And I hate to go at one guy, and I'm not trying to, I hate that, right? These guys they're all professionals. They've earned their keep, but sometimes you got to point out specifics to help people understand where your head's at. And I think for me, it's like when you're starting linebacker, one of your starting safeties, it's very, very, it's rough. And then on top of that, look, do I expect big things from Devondre Sweat? Absolutely. But I think that we could agree on this. If Devondre Sweat doesn't become that guy we think he could, or if he doesn't have a good rookie year, he's a big part of how they play defense.
He went a little bit high, yeah.
Right. He's going to be a big part of this 3-4 centric Titans team where you have to kind of make that work. So there's contingencies on defense that worry me. And then on the offensive side, as you've already talked about, right, you likely have 3 spots of this line filled. But if Skoronski doesn't make a jump and Lathan has a really bad freshman, I'm over here playing too much NCAA recently, guys. If JC Lathan doesn't have a good rookie season, all of a sudden you're in a position where the O-line's not playing good ball this year, and we need Will Levis to make a jump. I mean, you can put the 2 and 2 together. The bottom line is there's just, as we say about a few teams this year, the Titans are definitely in the top 3. too many question marks along with the positives for me to say I'm willing to look past the negatives. This is a playoff team. It's just there's just too much questions in the building. There just are.
I think with one more year of rebuilding, they can compete for like a 7th or 6th seed in the playoffs. I just think they're 1 year too early here.
I think I would agree with that 1000%. Titans fans, it's not slander. It's hope for the future. It's hope for building on the foundation. But I don't just this year, it would take a miracle for them to really, really make a push.